The day was gray and quiet, a typical winter morning. People gathered at a small church, dressed in their best clothes. It was a day of mourning, a day when the family came together to say goodbye to someone they loved. Everyone was here for the funeral of the grandmother, a woman who had lived a long life and left behind many memories. There was an air of sadness that hung over the group, but also a sense of calm, as if this was the way things were meant to be. Among the crowd sat a young girl named Emma. She was only 8 years old, with dark brown hair and big eyes that looked around nervously. She sat beside her father, Jack, who kept his arm around her, trying to offer comfort. Emma had been close to her grandmother, spending hours playing and listening to stories. But today, something was different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something felt off. The church was full of relatives, some of whom Emma barely knew. She felt out of place in the sea of faces, trying her best to stay quiet. Her father looked down at her every now and then, giving her a reassuring smile. He was holding it together, just like everyone else. But as the funeral service began, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The atmosphere was heavy with grief. The eulogy had begun, and a distant cousin of her father's stood up to speak. He talked about Grandma's life, how she had been a loving mother, a kind neighbor, and a friend to so many. Emma could see the tears in her father's eyes as he nodded along, trying to hold back his emotions. But Emma's mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about the conversation she had overheard in the past few days, the whispers among family members. They seemed to hint at something she didn't quite understand. But one thing was clear. There were secrets that no one was talking about. As her cousin spoke, Emma started to feel more and more uncomfortable. Her small hands twitched in her lap, and she shifted nervously in her seat. She wasn't sure why, but she felt like she needed to say something. She didn't know what exactly, but something inside of her seemed to push her to do it. Her father looked at her again and gave her a soft smile, a gesture meant to calm her, but Emma didn't feel calm. She felt like the room was closing in on her. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts, but when she opened them again, she saw everyone's eyes on her. With a deep breath, Emma stood up. She felt everyone's gaze on her, and for a brief moment, she wondered if she should sit back down. But something inside of her wouldn't let her. The words were there, and she knew she had to say them. The room went completely silent, the hum of whispers fading into nothing. "I know something." Emma's voice broke the silence, making everyone in the room turn their heads toward her. It wasn't much, just a simple statement, but the way she said it made everyone stop and listen. Her father's face went pale. He looked at her with wide eyes, unsure of what she was about to say. The air in the room felt thick. People were shifting uncomfortably, and Emma could feel the weight of their gazes on her. Her heart raced, but she didn't back down. She opened her mouth again, ready to share what had been on her mind. Little did anyone know, the truth she was about to reveal would change everything. The silence in the church felt suffocating. Everyone waited for Emma to speak, unsure of what she meant. Her father, Jack, looked at his daughter with confusion and worry. He had no idea what was going on in her mind. Why was she speaking out now, at a moment like this? Emma's small voice had interrupted the funeral, and it seemed like the whole room was holding its breath. Emma stood there, feeling the weight of all the eyes on her. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she gripped the edge of the wooden pew in front of her for support. She glanced at her father, who gave her a worried smile. He wanted to tell her to sit back down, to stop speaking out, but something in his gut told him that this moment was bigger than just a child interrupting a ceremony. The room was still. No one dared to speak. The elderly man who had been giving the eulogy now paused, unsure if he should continue. The relatives around him exchanged nervous glances, their whispers growing louder as they wondered what had gotten into Emma. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what his daughter was thinking. He had always known Emma to be a quiet and shy child. She wasn't one to speak up, especially not in front of a crowd. Something was wrong, and it was clear that whatever Emma had to say was important. "Emma," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sweetheart, what's going on? What are you talking about?" But Emma didn't respond right away. She looked down at the floor, her mind racing. She knew what she was about to say would be shocking, but she also knew she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. The feeling had been building inside her for days, and now in this moment, she felt like it was her only chance to speak the truth. She opened her mouth again, but her words got tangled. She had never been good with words, especially not when they were so important. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest, but she knew she had to go on. "I know something about Grandma," Emma said, her voice steady but quiet. "Something that nobody else knows." A gasp rippled through the room, and the tension thickened. Jack's face turned pale, and his stomach dropped. He had no idea what Emma was about to say, but he could sense the seriousness in her tone. The last thing he wanted was for this day, which was already heavy with grief, to turn into something far more complicated. I heard Grandma talking to someone," Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said some things that I didn't understand at first, but now I think I do." Her words were innocent, but the way she spoke them made them feel like a confession, like something deep and hidden. Jack's mind began to race. What could his mother have possibly said? Who was she talking to? He could feel his hands starting to sweat, but he held his composure, trying not to let the panic show. The other family members were equally puzzled, whispering to each other as they tried to make sense of what Emma was saying. Had they heard correctly? Was the child simply confused? Or was there something more to this? Emma's words hung in the air, unanswered, as she looked around at the crowd. The room felt colder, quieter. No one knew what to do next. But Emma wasn't done. She had more to say, and everyone in the room knew they were about to hear something that would change everything. The room was thick with confusion. Every eye was on Emma, and she could feel the weight of their stares. Her heart raced, but she couldn't back down now. She had started this, and she needed to finish it. The words she was about to say weren't easy, but they had been bottled up inside of her for too long. Her father, Jack, sat frozen, his face pale, and his hands clenched tightly. He was struggling to understand what was happening. Emma was a quiet girl, never one to draw attention to herself. She had never said anything like this before. His mind raced, trying to figure out if he had missed something, if there was something about his mother's life he didn't know. "Emma," Jack whispered, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about? What did Grandma say?" Emma took a deep breath and looked around the room, noticing how everyone seemed to lean forward, hanging on her every word. The murmurs had died down, and all that could be heard was the distant ticking of a clock in the corner of the church. "I heard Grandma talking to someone on the phone," Emma began, her voice steady, though soft. "She was talking about a secret, something about the family." A hush fell over the crowd. Everyone was listening now, but no one dared to interrupt her. Emma paused for a moment, as if to gather her thoughts. She had never shared this with anyone before, not even her father. She had always thought it was just something her grandmother had said in passing, but now, after hearing so much talk from the family, these past few days, it didn't seem like a small thing anymore. "Grandma said she was hiding something," Emma continued. "She said it was something that could change everything for us." The word hung in the air like a weight. Jack felt his stomach twist, and a cold sweat began to form on his brow. He looked around at the relatives who were now whispering among themselves, trying to process what Emma had just revealed. "Do you know what she meant?" Jack asked, his voice shaking. He needed answers, but Emma just shook her head. "I don't know," she said, her voice small. But it seemed like she was worried, like she didn't want anyone to find out. Jack's mind raced. His grandmother had always been a quiet, reserved woman. She had kept to herself and never shared much about her past. He had never suspected that there was anything hidden. But now, after hearing Emma's words, He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been kept from him. As Emma finished speaking, the room was silent once again. Everyone had heard what she said, but no one knew what to make of it. Some of the relatives looked confused, others angry. Jack, however, was frozen in place, his mind spinning with questions. What was this secret? Why hadn't anyone told him about it? And why did Emma, of all people, know about it? Before anyone could speak, Emma added one final thing. Grandma said it had something to do with Dad. At that moment, Jack's world seemed to stop. He felt the blood drain from his face as his thoughts swirled into chaos. How could Emma know something like that? What had Grandma meant? The words stung him like 1,000 tiny needles, and the room seemed to close in around him. Everyone was silent. They all waited for Jack's reaction. His face was pale, and his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. This was no longer just a simple family secret. It was something far deeper, something that would shake the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about his family. The room remained still, as if time had stopped. Jack's mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. His heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat covered his palms. The words his daughter had just spoken echoed in his ears. It has something to do with Dad. He couldn't breathe for a moment. His thoughts scrambled, each one racing faster than the last. What could it possibly mean? What had his mother hidden, and why would Emma know about it? He glanced at her, standing there with wide eyes, completely unaware of the chaos she had just caused. She was just a little girl. How could she have this information? Emma, Jack whispered, his voice strained. What do you mean? What exactly did Grandma say about me? Emma looked at him, her eyes full of uncertainty. She had never seen her father look so frightened, and it made her feel small and helpless. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she could tell that whatever it was serious. She hadn't meant to upset him or anyone else. She was just telling the truth. I don't know, Daddy, Emma said softly. I just remember Grandma saying something about keeping it a secret for a long time. She said that if anyone found out, it would ruin everything. Her voice trailed off, as if the weight of her own words was starting to settle on her young shoulders. Jack sat back, his mind still racing. He couldn't understand why his mother, of all people, would keep something like this hidden from him. He had always thought they had a strong, honest relationship. His mother had never seemed like someone who would keep secrets, especially from him. But now, as he thought about the strange conversations he had overheard in the past, the quiet whispers among family members, he started to wonder if there was more to his mother's life than he had ever realized. His relatives, who had been listening in silence, were now beginning to murmur among themselves. Some seemed shocked, others confused, but all of them were clearly troubled by Emma's revelation. Jack could feel their eyes on him, but his focus remained entirely on his daughter. He needed to understand the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Emma, Jack said, his voice trembling with emotion. Why didn't you tell me this before? Why now, at the funeral? Emma, still unsure of how to explain, shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know how to say it before, she explained softly. I didn't want to make anyone upset, but I thought about it, and I felt like I should say it today, because it's important. Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He felt a deep sense of betrayal, but he couldn't bring himself to be angry with Emma. She was just a little girl, and all she had done was speak the truth as she knew it. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just Emma who had been kept in the dark, it was everyone. His whole family had been living under a cloud of secrets, and no one had even known it. He looked up at the crowd, his face pale. We need to find out what's going on. I'm not going to leave here without answers. The room was still. No one said anything, but they all seemed to understand that something bigger was at play. They had all assumed that the day would be filled with tears and goodbyes. But now, it was clear that something much more complicated had been set in motion. Jack took a deep breath and stood up, still trying to collect his thoughts. His family waited for him to speak, but he had no idea where to begin. He needed to talk to someone who might know the truth. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was no one left to turn to. The only person who might know what was going on was his mother, and she was gone. Jack could feel his mind unraveling. The truth his daughter had just revealed weighed heavily on him, and he struggled to process everything. His mother, the woman he had always trusted, had apparently been hiding something so significant that even Emma knew about it. The idea of secrets buried deep within his family was a thought he could barely grasp, but it was there, and it was undeniable. He stood frozen in place, staring blankly at the floor, his thoughts spinning. His heart raced, and his hands felt cold and clammy. Every breath felt like a struggle. He had always prided himself on being the strong one in his family, the one who could handle any situation, no matter how tough. But now he was drowning in confusion and fear. What had his mother been hiding? And why hadn't she told him? As he stood there, paralyzed by his thoughts, Emma remained by his side, her small face full of concern. She had no idea what was going on in her father's mind, but she could sense the storm inside him. She had never seen him like this before. Normally, he was calm and in control, but now he seemed lost, struggling to figure out what to do. "Dad." Emma's voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension in the room. "Are you okay?" Her words seemed to snap Jack out of his trance. He turned to look at her, his face pale and drawn. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything was going to be fine, but he couldn't. He didn't know how to fix this. He didn't even know where to start. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He forced a smile, though it felt thin and weak. "I'm okay, sweetie. I'm just trying to figure this out." His voice was unsteady, and the uncertainty in his words only made Emma more worried. The room remained quiet, the only sound the soft murmurs of the relatives, who were now exchanging uncertain glances. It was clear that no one knew what to say. Some were still processing the shock of Emma's revelation, while others were starting to whisper among themselves. The atmosphere had shifted from one of grief to confusion, and the air felt thick with tension. Jack could feel the eyes of the family on him, but it was as if they were all miles away. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. How was he supposed to move forward when the foundation of everything he thought he knew had just been shaken? "Dad, what's wrong?" Emma asked again, her voice full of concern. She reached up and gently took his hand, as if to offer comfort, but Jack barely noticed. He was lost in his thoughts, trying to make sense of the strange puzzle that had just been put before him. "I don't know," Jack replied softly, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." It was then that the weight of everything hit him. His mother was gone, and there was no way to ask her about what she had said. There was no one left who could give him the answers he so desperately needed. The panic began to build inside him. He had no control over this, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely powerless. The silence in the room grew heavier, as Jack's emotions began to spill over. He couldn't hold them in any longer. The frustration, the confusion, the fear, it all mixed together and overwhelmed him. Without thinking, Jack turned and rushed out of the church. He needed to get away from everyone, to find some space where he could think clearly. His relatives watched him go, unsure of what had just happened. Some whispered to each other, while others simply stared, trying to make sense of the sudden emotional shift. Emma stood there, her heart heavy with concern for her father. She didn't understand everything, but she knew one thing for sure. Things would never be the same again. Jack's feet felt heavy as he left the church, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. He barely noticed the people staring at him, their worried eyes following him as he walked briskly across the parking lot. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, echoing in his ears. He needed air. He needed space. When he reached his car, Jack slammed the door behind him, letting out a deep breath, trying to collect himself. His hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. He couldn't sit there, frozen in panic, not knowing what was happening to his family. He had to do something, anything. But what? As he sat there, the cold air flowing through the cracked window, his mind kept circling back to the same question. What did Emma mean by something to do with Dad? What had his mother hidden from him? He needed to find out the truth, no matter how difficult it was. The silence in the car was suffocating, and the weight of the situation pressed down on him harder than ever before. In a sudden panic, Jack grabbed his phone. His hands fumbled as he unlocked the screen. He wasn't sure who he was supposed to call, but his instincts told him to contact someone who could help him make sense of everything. His fingers hovered over the contacts for a moment, but then he dialed the only number that seemed urgent. His breathing became shallow as the phone rang. He wasn't sure if he was overreacting, but something about Emma's words had shaken him to the core. He needed guidance, he needed help, and maybe the police could offer some answers, or at least help him get through this emotional storm. When the operator picked up, Jack's voice cracked as he spoke. 911. What's your emergency? The operator's calm voice cut through the chaos in Jack's mind. I don't know if this is an emergency, Jack stammered, his words rushing out in a jumble. But something's wrong. My daughter, she just said something that doesn't make sense. And I think it's important. The operator's voice remained steady, guiding him gently. Sir, take a deep breath. Can you explain what happened? I'm here to help. Jack closed his eyes, trying to steady his thoughts. My daughter, she just told us that my late mother, was hiding something about me, and I don't know what it is, but she said it was a secret. And now, I'm afraid. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. There was a pause on the line. Jack could hear the operator typing, gathering information. It felt like an eternity before the operator spoke again. Sir, I understand that this is very distressing. But at this point, it doesn't seem like there's an immediate danger. However, I strongly suggest you stay calm and talk to someone you trust. Do you have a family member or friend nearby who can be with you? Jack's mind raced again, and he shook his head, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. I don't know. I just need to understand what's going on. I don't know who I can trust. My whole family. Everyone's acting strange. And I feel like I'm losing control. The operator's voice softened. Sir, I understand this is a lot to process, but please try to stay calm. If you feel like this situation escalates or becomes dangerous, don't hesitate to call back. In the meantime, I recommend talking to your family. Communication is key right now. Jack sighed heavily, feeling the weight of the operator's advice. He wasn't sure if he could talk to anyone right now, but it seemed like the only option left. Okay, I'll try it, he muttered, his voice barely audible. After a few more exchanges, the operator reassured Jack that help was always available if he needed it, and they ended the call. Jack sat there in the car, his phone still in his hand. He didn't feel any better. In fact, he felt worse. The call had done little to ease his fears or give him clarity, but at least someone had listened. As he sat in the stillness, Jack realized he had no more answers than he had before. He still didn't know what his mother had been hiding. He still didn't know what Emma had meant. But one thing was certain now: his life, and his family's life, had been changed forever. After the call ended, Jack sat there in the car, staring blankly ahead. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to press down on him, making it hard to breathe. His hands were still trembling from the phone call, and his mind was a blur of questions. He had hoped that speaking to the 911 operator might bring him some answers, but instead, he felt more lost than ever. He had learned nothing. No one could explain what Emma had said or what his mother had been hiding. His family was still in shock, unsure how to process the bombshell Emma had dropped at the funeral. The room had been filled with whispers, and the few words exchanged since had only added to the confusion. Jack knew he had to return to the church. He had left without saying anything to anyone, and now he felt like he was abandoning them all in the middle of a crisis. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but it felt like a distant sound, as if the world around him had slowed down. As he drove back to the church, his thoughts turned to Emma. She was so young, and yet she had already uncovered something hidden within their family. Jack wondered how much of the truth she really understood. Did she realize the weight of what she had said? Or had she just repeated something she overheard without fully grasping its significance? By the time Jack arrived, the funeral was winding down. People were starting to leave, their faces tired from the emotional day. It seemed like the mourning had shifted from grief to uncertainty. Relatives were still talking in hushed voices, exchanging worried glances. The atmosphere had completely changed from when the service had first started. No longer was it just about saying goodbye to his mother. It had turned into something much more complicated, a mystery with no clear answers. Jack stepped out of his car and walked slowly toward the church. His legs felt heavy as he approached the door, and a part of him wanted to turn back. But he knew he couldn't. Emma was inside. His family was inside, and he had to face whatever was waiting for him. Inside, Emma was sitting quietly at a back pew, her small hands folded in her lap. Her wide eyes looked up as her father entered the church, and she instantly stood up, sensing the tension in the air. "Dad," she said softly, her voice full of concern. "Are you okay?" Jack smiled weakly and nodded. He didn't want to make his daughter feel more worried than she already was, but he couldn't hide the strain in his expression. His mind was still racing, and every step he took seemed to get heavier. "I'm okay, sweetie," Jack replied, trying to sound reassuring. "But we need to talk." The other relatives had gathered around, still in small groups, murmuring to each other. Jack took a deep breath and approached them. His uncle, a tall man with a serious face, was the first to meet him. "Jack," his uncle said quietly, his voice low with concern. "We're all just trying to understand what happened. Emma, she said something we don't understand. Is there something we should know?" Jack took a moment, glancing around at the group of family members who had gathered. They all looked at him with expectant eyes, unsure what to say or how to proceed. "I don't know yet," Jack admitted, "but I'm going to find out. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it together." His uncle nodded, though the tension on his face remained. It seemed that no one in the room had any answers, but they were all waiting for Jack to take the lead. As the moments passed, Jack could feel the eyes of his family members on him. They were looking to him for strength, for direction. He knew they expected him to fix this, to make everything right. But the truth was, Jack had no idea how to solve this mystery, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he even could. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, as Jack stood in front of his family. They were all looking at him, waiting for him to say something that would make sense of everything. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, and Jack felt a strange sense of powerlessness. He had always been the one to solve problems, to make things right, but right now he had no answers to offer. He looked at Emma, who stood quietly beside him, her small hand resting in his. She didn't understand the full extent of what was happening, but Jack could see the worry in her eyes. She had done nothing wrong, yet it was her words that had set this chain of events in motion. She was just a child, and this was too much for her to bear. "Dad, what's going on?" Emma asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's heart broke at the sound of her innocent question. How could he explain any of this to her? How could he explain the confusion and fear that was swirling inside him? "I don't know, sweetheart," Jack replied, his voice shaky. "But we'll figure it out, okay?" The family members around him were still waiting for some kind of explanation. His uncle, who had been the first to approach him earlier, stepped forward again, his face etched with concern. "Jack, we need to know what's going on. You said you'd find out the truth. What did Emma mean by what she said?" Jack swallowed hard. He had no idea how to answer. What had his mother been hiding? Why had Emma known about it? And why hadn't he known sooner? Every part of him wanted to lash out, to demand answers, but he knew that wasn't going to help. The anger that simmered inside him was useless unless he could get to the heart of the matter. "I don't know," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But whatever it is, it's something that I should have known. I don't know how to explain it." The silence in the room grew heavier. Jack could feel the weight of his family's expectations on him, but it only made him feel more lost. What kind of father was he if he couldn't even protect his own family from the secrets of the past? Emma tugged at his hand, drawing his attention back to her. "Dad, I'm scared. What if Grandma's secret is something bad? What if we don't know what to do?" Jack bent down, looking into his daughter's eyes. He didn't have an answer for her, but he knew he had to reassure her. "Sweetheart, I promise you, we'll figure this out. We'll face it together, and no matter what it is, we'll be okay." His words, though meant to comfort, didn't seem to ease the tension in the room. The family was still waiting for answers, but Jack didn't have them. He could feel the pressure building, and every minute that passed without clarity only made the situation feel worse. The more he thought about his mother's secret, the more questions arose. What could be so important that Emma knew, but no one else did? Jack's eyes shifted to the front of the church, where his mother's casket stood, a constant reminder that the answers he needed were no longer available. She was gone, and now Jack was left to carry the weight of the secret she had kept. He had always believed he knew his mother inside and out, but now he wondered how much of her life had been hidden from him. The unanswered questions seemed endless. The more Jack thought about them, the more frustrated he became. How could he ever move forward without knowing the truth? How could he fix the damage that had already been done? "I need to go through her things," Jack said suddenly, his voice firm, as if the decision had just come to him. "There has to be something. Some clue, some way to figure out what's been going on." His family looked at him in silence. No one said a word, but Jack could tell they all agreed. He needed to find the truth. Whatever it took, he would uncover it. And he would do it for Emma. The days after the funeral passed in a blur. Jack found himself unable to focus on anything other than the mystery that had been revealed. The secret his mother had kept, and Emma's words, still echoed in his mind, louder with each passing hour. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were just out of reach, hidden somewhere in the things his mother had left behind. Jack had spent most of the past few days going through his mother's belongings. The house was quiet, the rooms filled with things that once belonged to her. But as he sifted through old letters, photos, and trinkets, he found nothing that gave him any clues. It was as if everything had been carefully arranged, as though his mother had known he would come searching for answers. But the more Jack searched, the more frustrated he became. Every drawer he opened, every box he examined seemed to be empty of the truth he desperately sought. Emma stayed close by his side, sensing her father's unease. She had always been a curious child, but now she seemed quieter than usual. She didn't ask many questions, but Jack could see the worry in her eyes. She knew her father was struggling, and she wished she could help, but there was nothing she could do. One afternoon, as Jack sat at the kitchen table, staring at a pile of papers, his mind began to wander. He had been looking for something tangible, some document, some letter, but so far, there was nothing. His mother had been so private, so careful with what she kept hidden. It was starting to feel like there was no way to know the truth. But then, as Jack sorted through a stack of old photographs, something caught his eye. It was a picture of his mother, one he hadn't seen before. In the photo, she was standing next to a man Jack didn't recognize. The man's face was blurry, but Jack could make out the shape of a familiar necklace that his mother had worn for years. She had always been protective of that necklace, and Jack remembered how she would never let anyone touch it. His heart raced as he stared at the photo. Who was this man? And why had his mother kept this picture hidden? Was it possible that the secret Emma had uncovered was tied to this stranger? Jack's hands trembled as he picked up the photograph. His mind raced with questions, but one thought stood out above the rest. This was the clue he had been waiting for. He needed to find out who this man was, and why his mother had kept him hidden from the family. Without wasting any more time, Jack grabbed the phone and dialed the only number he could think of: his uncle's. He needed help, and his uncle had always been the one person who might know something about his mother's past. The phone rang several times before his uncle picked up. "Jack, what's going on? Have you found anything?" Jack took a deep breath. "I found something," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "A photo. There's a man in it, and he's wearing the same necklace Mom always wore. Do you know who he is?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jack's uncle didn't speak for a moment, and Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. Was this the moment he would finally get some answers? "I know who he is," his uncle said, his voice low. "But it's not something I'm proud of." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He had been waiting for this moment, and now the truth was within reach. "Who is he?" Jack demanded. "What does this all mean?" His uncle sighed deeply. "I'll come over, Jack. We need to talk. There's a lot you don't know."